So, thanks a lot for spending the time
Yeah, you're welcome.
talking about kind of a significant period, quite a long time ago now, I guess. But
Yeah.
I was going to start first of all by asking kind of, what brought you to the centre, and how would you summarise the atmosphere that you found when you got there?
Right. Well, what I was looking for were maybe three things. I sort of came into academia and the idea of working in academia as a career, I guess, from political activism. And I'd been very involved in the women's movement. I did my MA in Women's Studies. I did it part-time while I was involved in various political campaigns. So I was looking for a political context in the academy, and in a way Birmingham Cultural Studies seemed the obvious place in Britain. I thought about the History of Consciousness programme at Santa Cruz, which I guess felt like something of the US equivalent, not quite. But Birmingham seemed to be the place where, with this sort of intellectual and political vibrancy. So I was looking for that. I was looking for a place where you could think about the politics of knowledge, and you could think about knowledge in a more political way, and you could do research that was kind of informed by multiple influences, really. So I wanted somewhere that was informed by feminism, that was informed by Marxism, that was addressing psychoanalysis, that was interested in popular culture. So it seemed to bring together all those things, but without having an orthodoxy. So I felt like I could go there and no one was going to say, oh, you can't combine feminist psychoanalytic theory with an empirical audience study, which is what I ended up doing, because a lot of places that I might have gone, I could have come up against, well, you have to either do the empirical study or you have to do the psychoanalytic theories of the subject and of visual pleasure and so on. But I wanted to sort of do something in between. And lots of people said to me, lots of people who knew about the centre said to me, this is a place where you're allowed to experiment. So I was looking for an experimental context, I guess. And then finally, I wanted to be in a place that was collaborative. And I think the literature that they sent out, I was at Birmingham from 85 to 92, so I was applying sort of in 1984, I guess. And the literature they sent out to postgraduates who were applying said things like, you don't have to have a completely worked out project to come here. You have to have some ideas and want to be part of what we're doing, and we'll help you develop those. And so that idea of collaboration really drew me in, and I guess especially the publications, which I'm sure is what most people would say. The publications spoke to the desire to work collaboratively, which goes against that sort of more individualistic culture that characterises the academy, I guess.
So where were you previously then?
I was I was an undergraduate at Sussex, which was a very interdisciplinary place to do an undergraduate degree in the 70s. So, I was in European Studies, majoring in German, but it was half my degree was in interdisciplinary courses. And then I did the Women's Studies MA at Kent, but carried on living in Brighton and did it part-time, and spent the other half of my time in Brighton really sort of doing various kind of political campaigns and being involved in Labour Party, feminist campaigns around stop pit closures, those kinds of things, and also coming up in Brighton, I guess through the WEA, through the Workers' Education Association, which was very lively in Brighton and very connected to sort of left politics and feminist politics. And when I was in Brighton, I think we taught 3 courses, adult education courses, through the WEA. One was called Growing Up Female, which I'm not sure you teach anymore. One was called Women in Socialist Countries, which I'm also not sure you teach anymore. And one was Interdisciplinary Lesbian Studies course, which was one of the first lesbian studies courses, I think, education in Britain, and there was a group of us did that. So I was coming from that kind of context, and Birmingham, I wanted to do a PhD that would continue some of those connections, really. So Birmingham seemed to be full of people doing that, and people who knew about it said, oh yes, this is the kind of thing they might be interested in.
Did it, when you arrived there, so was it 1985?
85,
Did it meet your kind of preconceptions, or how did the reality match what you heard?
Yeah. Yes and no, I guess. It met my preconceptions in the sense that it was incredibly vibrant and energetic. It was very, very intense. It was a very intense space. And I think probably I was looking for that. So, yes, in that way. It was shortly after I arrived, it was in a state of transformation. So, I think one of the things that really is important to think about reflecting back on the centre is that people like me were coming in with impossible expectations. We probably idealised it and thought it was going to, answer all our frustrations with the academy, or bring together a sort of political space where race, class, gender, sexuality were all in dialogue with each other. And so there's a book by Robin Wiegman that I've just been reading called Object Lessons, where she talks about field imaginaries, that they're around a field, like cultural studies. There's this sort of imaginary that builds up, which is to do with projected desires that can't possibly be fulfilled. So in a way it's bound to also disappoint. And I guess when I arrived, there was a very dynamic international group of both MA and PhD students, and almost everyone on the course was politically involved in some way. And so there was this, there were sometimes clashes, sometimes productive, sometimes not. There was definitely a huge division between those people that were interested in psychoanalysis, in post-structuralism, in theories of subjectivity in particular ways, and those who were more involved in sort of grassroots class activism, having a more traditional notion of Marxism and sort of class politics. So there were big clashes, and that was fine. In a sense, that's what you went expecting, and so on. But the institution, the University of Birmingham, had obviously always really detested this place, and had been at regular intervals coming and knocking at the door and objecting to various things. And one of the reasons I was really drawn to the centre was, they had these alternative practices, academic practices. So I was involved in the selection of the candidates for the year after. I was on the interview panel and stuff, and that's sort of unheard of. And there was a lot of sort of collective decision making and discussions and meetings and so on. So I'd gone wanting to be part of that, and I guess shortly after I arrived, really, the university came knocking again and said, you have to change, you're going to have to rethink who's in the centre. We're not sure about sociology at this university. You might have to merge with sociology, or that we might close sociology, and some of those people might. So there was that going on. There was also, you have to provide undergraduate degrees now. You can't be sitting around doing all this postgraduate stuff and not be actually providing undergraduate degrees. So there was sort of a push in terms of personnel and in terms of disciplinary kind of links with sociology, and then there was a push in terms of getting rid of some of the alternative practices, trying to break down barriers between staff and postgrads, which the university clearly didn't like. So shortly after I got there was in some ways a sense of disappointment, because we were suddenly presented with, actually we're going to have to change all this. And that's what I'd gone there for. So, we had a lot of meetings, they were very heated. I was one of the very frustrated, grumpy postgrads about the changes. I'm sure that was extremely annoying for the staff, who were just trying to, manage this demand from the university and not be closed, really. So yeah, so in some ways it met my expectations. It was a very, very stimulating and open place, and open in terms of lots of dialogue, lots of energy, lots of possibilities, and yet you sort of felt the shadow of this institutional disapproval and desire to control, really, and desire to reshape, and a sense, I guess, of relative powerlessness on behalf of the centre.
I mean, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I mean, who took the lead in those negotiations with the wider university, and how, and to what extent were you, as a postgraduate and postgraduates in general, involved in those negotiations?
Well, I mean, the people that took the lead and the people, in a way, probably that bore the brunt of the work and the stress were the 3 permanent members of staff. So that was Richard Johnson, who was director, Michael Green and Maureen McNeil, who were the only other 2 staff when I joined. So they, in a way, they bore the brunt of it, but because the practice of the centre had been set up as more collective and having these weekly meetings and discussing things and making decisions collectively, there was an attempt to do that. But it was, I mean, I'm sure everybody would have different accounts of that, but there wasn't really very much space for the postgrads to do very much, apart from complain or campaign or a bit of both, to try and resist this change. And you know, there was a big campaign, as there was kind of in regular waves really throughout the centre's history, where people wrote in letters and said, this is, you know, internationally renowned centre, its postgrad work is very important, these books, these publications between staff and postgrads, very important. So yeah, I guess there was a large group of postgrads who were not happy about the direction that it was going and really didn't want those changes to happen, especially their involvement in future selections of students and so on. And we were very vocal, and as I said, I'm sure from the permanent members of staff's point of view, very annoying. I mean, I do remember feeling bad after several meetings and saying to Richard Johnson something like, "Oh, I'm sorry, we're making our lives miserable, aren't we?" And he said, no, legitimate postgraduate politicking, fine, carry on, you know. So he kind of was trying to keep that space open, but actually it didn't seem to me that there was very much choice. Looking back, I don't think they had very much choice, and looking back, I think we probably didn't realise how fragile they were, and that they were subject to closure in a way that we just sort of couldn't imagine, because to us, you know, having arrived there, it was this amazing place that everybody knew about, and it had an extraordinary reputation, and that's what we wanted to be part of. So there was a conflict of interest to some extent, because we wanted it to stay the same because that's how we'd imagined it before we got there, and the staff were trying to, you know, they obviously they had a wider view of the university. They knew that the university had been you know, unhappy with its modes of operating in the past, and they probably could see the vulnerability that we couldn't see. And there were colleagues, you know, they were closing sociology, so there was collegiality and solidarity to think about, and obviously people coming over from sociology were people who were interested in the kinds of issues that the centre had been working on, so I'm sure that there was, you know, that was really important as well. It was about people's jobs and livelihoods and so on. So yeah, there was a conflict of interest, and that was expressed, I think, fairly vocally, fairly regularly. But I'm not sure in the end the postgrads did much to shape its future. I'm not sure the university were really interested in listening to postgrads. I think that was part of the point, actually. I think they thought the postgrads were far too vocal.
And one of the things we're interested in is kind of the everyday life of the centre,
yeah.
Of which what you've just talked about, I'm sure, played quite a considerable part.
Yeah.
But what I was going to ask you was, what did the average kind of working week look like in terms of your commitment to the centre and your commitments outside of the centre and in the wider university in Birmingham? How did that? Could you summarise what that looked like? Or? not very easy.
Yeah, no, there was, it was a sort of combination of, there was a fairly regular structure, and then, but quite a lot of, well, a huge amount of freedom, actually, in terms of what you got up to in the rest of your time. So the regular structure was, you know, certainly Monday, Tuesday, you'd be in doing stuff. The MA course, that was sort of the core every year, even if you weren't doing the MA. So I joined the MA course even though I was a PhD student. That was how you felt part of things. That was the sort of continuity through the year. So the MA course was sort of Monday, late afternoon, early evening, as I remember, and kind of everyone came. And that was taught by one of the three, Michael, Richard and Maureen. So that was a sort of must. And then there were the subgroups, and most people joined, a couple of them, 2 or 3 of them, depending on whether you're part-time or full-time. So you kind of, there was this sort of intense focus to the start of the week, and then slight rippling into subgroups, working groups. You know, I think I was on the stencil papers group as well, and then I was on the admissions group, so we were sort of interviewing or reading the applications, interviewing students for next year. So I was doing that, and then I think I was in a couple of subgroups. And then after a while I was working in a group called the Women Thesis Writers Group that we just formed, which is kind of very much what it was like. People just sort of formed things. It was very generative of, and very facilitating, I think, in that way. You could just sort of say, okay, we're doing this now, and people would think, good, you know. Good idea, go and do it. And people were very, there were lots and lots of ideas about new things to do. So the Women Thesis Writers Group initially was like a support group, really, for a group of feminists doing their PhDs in cultural studies, and still a couple of people outside the centre. I think Celia Lurie was actually, she used to spend a lot of time in the centre, but actually she was at Wolverhampton at that time, and she'd already done a PhD, and she was kind of wanted to be part of it. And we used to sit and read each other's work and comment on each other's work, and then that's in the end what became Off Centre Feminism and Cultural Studies, which Sarah Franklin, Celia Lurie and I co-edited. So that was a focus for several years, and we would meet, you know, maybe every other week or something like that. So that was the other thing, and then in the midst of this, we were busy trying to read about, understand, but also challenge Thatcherism, and Section 28, or Clause 28 as it was at first called, Section 28 of the Local Government Act, making it illegal to support anything that promoted homosexuality, to be funded by local government funding, so libraries, schools, that kind of thing was affected. And so a group of us, connected up with an unlikely group of allies in many ways, but there were a group in Birmingham, some coming from Socialist Workers' Party, some coming from the Centre, some coming from Labour Party, and so on. And so it was a big group called the Stop the Clause campaign. And we did a lot of work both in the centre and through the centre, and also outside it. And so we would spend at least one day a week probably doing that work as well. You might want to shut the door. And then, you know, you're supposed to be doing a PhD. So
how did you find time to do
so
that?
it was hard.
Right.
It was really hard, and especially in the first year. I mean, the first year I think I was just so excited to be involved in everything and wanted to read and be part of subgroups and so on. I was just sort of finding my feet. I did very little really on my PhD, although, you know, all those things feed in. But I didn't really sit in a room on my own 3 or 4 days a week doing my research like you see. You know, students do actually do that now, and you know, maybe by the second, third year I did a bit more of that. But there was definitely a sense that the collaborative energy, intellectual and political, was the point of being there, really, for me. And I really didn't quite know what my PhD was going to look like, so I did spend a lot of time sort of going in lots of different directions and not really knowing how to bring these two things together. the sort of psychoanalytic theories of spectatorship with a sort of empirical audience study to think about Hollywood stardom, and so I really spent the first year going up a lot of blind alleys and not really knowing what I was doing, and that was considered okay because that was sort of part of research practice really, that you didn't have to know exactly what you were doing before you got there. So yeah, so a typical week would be a couple of days doing all the reading and being part of the MA and the subgroups, and then maybe a day doing kind of political stuff, and then maybe some of the sort of admin groups in the centre organising things, and then maybe a day, maybe 2 days, sitting at home thinking, okay, how am I going to do this PhD? What's it going to look like? So yeah.
But what were the differences between, like, you touched on them a little bit, but the difference between like the sensible occasional papers group and the general group that everyone went to on Monday, you said, and then the subgroups that you joined, and then the subgroup that you co-founded. What were the differences in kind of atmosphere? I mean, was the general one more of a kind of a taught course that you came to listen at, and what was that like compared to the subgroups and the atmosphere within them?
Well, the MA was a taught course, and so that was, there were readings for that every week, and in some senses that took a fairly kind of conventional form, in the sense that, someone would present for the first hour or whatever, and then the second hour people would have discussion. So in some ways that was fairly structured. But interestingly, when we arrived, the MA syllabus hadn't been written because, well, what tended to happen was, there were always some little mini revolutions within each year. So the year before I arrived, people had said, oh, the MA syllabus should be more open, the students should define it, not the staff, and so we actually went to the first MA meeting. This is my memory of it. And the staff said, well, we're not going to give you a syllabus because last year's students said we should start from where you were and what you wanted to do. And so we were all a bit baffled by this, and I think we didn't really know how to respond, and we were quite a large group of MA and PhD students, and so we had to somehow gather ourselves together and come up with a syllabus. And I remember I was part of a small group who kind of offered to have a go at this, and we did the first term. We came up with the first term with this idea of trying to bring together sort of Marxism, feminism, and sort of post-colonial studies or anti-racist studies, and in a way that put each in dialogue with the other in sort of multiple ways across a 10-week course. So we came up with this, and I don't know, obviously thought it was ingenious at the time, and I remember we presented it back to the staff, and they said, well, no, this is very interesting, it's not cultural studies though. And so we'd kind of been given the task of inventing this thing that we'd come to find out what it was, and then we came up with something, and they then said, well, it's not cultural studies. And so we'd gone around in a circle, really. So we said, well, okay, but we've come to learn what cultural studies is, so you give us this. So even the syllabus, actually, the year we were there, was negotiated. And we did sort of follow something of what we'd suggested, and then the second term, they kind of said, okay, this is really what cultural studies is. Cultural studies is not just about, identity categories and how they intersect and how we might think about them. Cultural studies is this other set of issues. And so, yeah, so in some ways I say it was a conventional MA, in other ways it wasn't at all. But the feel of it was always quite charged, I think, I'd say. I don't know if other people would agree, but the MA meeting was where the sort of serious intellectual focus took place in quite a public way. Whereas the subgroups, they tended to be quite small, maybe 5 or 6 of you or whatever, and so you'd do some reading. So it was much less public. Whereas this was, there were a lot of people in the room, and it was in that famous room, with all the windows and a round table, and it was quite charged. There was definitely an expectation of intense exchange, definitely.
Was there a competitive element within that? You feel?
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, yes, I think, there was a feeling of there was probably a competitive element in terms of, you know, performing cleverness. I don't think that ever exits really in the academy. It's just there are better and worse versions of it, or there are ways of undercutting it even though it's present, but I don't think it ever fully disappears, or you can sort of wish that away. So there was some of that, but there was also a sort of competitiveness about, it wasn't so much competitiveness, there was also a tension around where the alliances were forming. There was definitely that feeling, like, if you said X about this reading, how were you positioning yourself in relation to this previous set of conflicts that you were very aware of between, you know, the post-structuralists and the Marxists, or between, you know, whichever groups. So there was a certain anxiety about alignment. And actually my very first introduction to the centre, before I enrolled as a PhD student, I went up to the end of year presentations of the year before. You know, we were invited to go and listen. And I had no idea what to expect. And it was 11 o'clock in the morning, and the first presentation was by a group who were clearly completely frustrated with identity politics and wanted to do a sort of performance presentation in a way that was about sticking their fingers up to that, you know, because they thought it was sort of essentialist and boring and reductionist and whatever else, and didn't have a theory of subjectivity really, was just obsessed with identity and, you know, claiming an identity, you know, as a woman this, and as a black person this, as a working class person, you know, and all of that, and they were totally frustrated with it. So this presentation that they did, they all sat in a row dressed in black. There was chilled white wine served at 11 AM, and the paper was, as I remember, called As an Arsehole I. So it was sort of speaking back to those identity claims that they were so frustrated with, and it carried on. And it was, you know, I don't know, it was really interesting and slightly terrifying and quite intimidating and somewhat pretentious, but very self-knowing about that. And then, of course, in the discussion, various people in the audience who felt very criticised by this and were much more associated with, you know, organised left groups, not just the Socialist Workers' Party, but that was definitely a presence. You know, they were furious, and then when there was a heated debate, and I was sitting in the back as a PhD student who was about to start there, and I was sort of thinking, yikes, you know, this is really, I mean, yeah, this is a space where you really have to know what you want to say before you sort of stand up and say it, otherwise you might get shot down. So it wasn't just competitive about who was the cleverest person in the room in the way that, you know, academia often is, but it was more, I mean, there were those moments of individualised competition, but it was more about which group or which position, which theoretical position, which political position, which combination of the two, if possible, was going to claim the space and was going to kind of not convince people exactly, but was going to claim its place, really. And how was it going to do that? And actually all of, you know, it was really interesting and exciting, as well as being quite intimidating. So yes, so when you say what was the mood of the week, I guess those MA classes in general weren't quite like that. That was a more spectacular version of some of the other discussions that would take place. But there was an intensity to it. So the MA sessions, there was always an intensity about loyalty and alignments and staking a claim, about who was going to stake a claim and on what basis, and were people going to go along with that. So the collectivity, I think, was partly about sharing power, it was partly about open debate, it was partly about those things, but it was also about taking part of the larger group in a particular direction and claiming a legitimacy for that.
I mean, what I was going to ask you about the motivations behind establishing the Women's Thesis Writers Group.
Yeah.
And the relationship between that and some of the other subgroups that were already there, and the historical subgroups like the women's group that eventually produced Women Take Issue.
Yeah.
How did all that come about?
I'm not sure if I can remember the detail, but I guess there was a women's group, and that already existed, and there was a discussion when I first arrived about whether that would continue. And then there was an argument about whether it should be called the feminist subgroup or the women's subgroup, and there were different views on that. So some people wanted it just more to be a support group for the women at the centre, and some people wanted it to be more discussing feminist theory, and some people wanted it to be somewhere in the middle. And I guess, Women Take Issue was hugely influential on me, and very much motivated a lot of feminists to go to the centre and want to do their PhDs there and stuff. So it was important to kind of think about how that might keep going, and that did keep going, and I think it still was. I think it continued to be called the women's group, but the women's subgroup. But anyway, but it was fairly general, and I guess some of us were busy writing our PhD chapters, and we really wanted a place where we could have a much more in-depth discussion of what we were writing. So we just formed a group, and I think most of us were from the centre, but then there was a couple of people from outside the centre who were interested in joining, and we didn't. When we started, we didn't have any intention of writing a book. That just sort of emerged as the chapters got a bit better, and we thought, these connect up, and this might be interesting, and so on. That's how the idea of the book emerged. And a third of the book comprises papers from the Science and Technology subgroup. So there was a Science and Technology subgroup which Maureen sort of led, and they were doing all work around Alton Bill and abortion and abortion rights and so on. So they were doing these kind of close readings of connecting parliamentary debates to newspaper accounts and so on. So, but it was all really dealing with feminist issues about reproductive politics. So a third of that kind of came into the book, and then there was an attempt to bring together some feminist debates about Thatcherism that spoke to these wider debates that already existed between Stuart Hall and Bob Jessup, and all of those sort of disagreements, and debates partly happening in Marxism today and so on. But the only thing that was different was the Women Thesis Writers Group. We met in our own homes, and so we didn't meet at the centre, and we tried to sort of sit around drinking cups of tea and be very, very informal. And it
was that a conscious decision to do that? Can you remember? Or not really?
I honestly can't remember. I expect it was. It might have been partly convenience, but I think it was partly a way of just trying to step outside some of the more intense atmosphere at the centre. I guess it was trying to just be very informal and open up a safe space in which to share your writing as a PhD student with other people, which is incredibly hard to do, because usually it's you're sort of fumbling around a bit, and you don't feel it's very good, and the only person that sees that is the supervisor. So this was an attempt to, I don't know if it was democratised, not really democratised, but this was an attempt to bring other people into dialogue with what you were doing, and hear comments and criticisms and suggestions from your peers, which strangely isn't very much part of postgraduate culture in general.
What was it? I mean, how do you sort of summarise the benefits and the disadvantages of group work and that process of group work? I mean, it's not so common now, of course. And
no.
So at the time, what was that process like, going through that?
Yes. No, it's not common now, and we're dominated by ref culture which actually discriminates against you if you, or isn't, you get told by your institution they're not interested in co-author publications and so on. So there's much more emphasis on individualised publication. I think, I mean, for me, probably, looking back, I might not have actually done a PhD if I hadn't been in that kind of environment. I really liked working more collaboratively and I really benefited hugely from that. I think I tend to develop my ideas in dialogue with people, and I don't know, maybe I would have done a PhD if I'd been in a more sort of isolated position, but I might not have done. So for me it was hugely enabling, and but also, you know, very difficult. Some of the collaborative writing, you know, is really hard work, and I remember listening to Stuart Hall talking about doing some of the earlier collaborative books where, you know, you'd have your paragraph that you'd worked on so hard, and then you'd sort of, they were all sitting around with, I guess maybe, yeah, pre-computers probably, or, so they were all sitting around with these bits of paper and putting together, you know, what they were going to agree was the introduction to the book or something, and watching his postgrads, you know, with their scissors cutting out his favourite paragraph and, you know, having to kind of negotiate that. So, yeah, it was also conflicted and difficult sometimes, and there were also, you know, casualties and exclusions, and yeah, and I'm sure people would have very painful stories as well about some of that. I think looking back, what is very striking. One of the things I've become quite interested in recently is the psychoanalysis of groups and group work, and how groups reproduce certain sort of familial patterns in fairly obvious ways, but in ways that don't really get talked about by people who work in groups. And so looking back, it's just very obvious that once you're working in both a large group, which is what the centre was, a large collective group, and then lots of subgroups, some of which overlap and connect and so on, that you're generating you're generating a kind of surge of anxiety and desire really coming together. So the desires are huge, and as I said before, probably not meetable, probably not fulfillable, and you know, that's exhilarating when it's going well and people are all desiring things in the same direction, and so the collaborative feel can be incredibly exciting, and give you this feeling of, yeah, potency and agency and so on, and yet I think it also generates a huge amount of anxiety. And if you haven't got clear boundaries to those groups, which there weren't often, you know, they were often open groups and people moving in and out, and some overlaps and some connections, and of course all the interpersonal stuff, like some people were living together, some people were living in shared houses, some people having relationships with each other, some people having relationships with, you know, more than one person, you know, so it was very intense, and because those boundaries weren't as clear as they are in sort of less interesting contexts maybe, produced a lot of anxiety that then sort of attached itself, probably sometimes in quite destructive, upsetting ways, in the way I think if you don't have clear boundaries and rules about a group, there's a sort of energy, you know, generates and goes around until it finds something to attach itself to, till it finds an object to attach to. So there was some of that, definitely, I think.
What was the relationship between the staff and the students? I mean, did particular students, you know, gravitate towards particular members of staff? You know, how did that play out within that energy that you just talked about?
Yeah, complicated. Yeah, very complicated. I mean, I think one of the things that was very particular about the centre, which isn't true, like certainly isn't true where I work now at the University of Manchester really, doesn't have its own kind of, the group doesn't have its own identity and history. And I think one of the things that was very important about the centre was you were coming into this very energetic space, and which had a really strong history. And so you were going to find your place not just in the present, but you were really going to find yourself in relation to that history, and where did you fit, and what did you, so and some of that history sort of became mythologised. So there were stories that circulated, and they became, you know, people had their favourite narratives they told about, I don't know, the popular memory group and the complexity of the dynamics within it and why the book never got published, or, you know. So so I guess the relationship between the staff and the postgraduates, you know, there were only 3 staff when I arrived, and they all had very different styles and very different ways of relating to the postgrads. And I think for me, I mean, I was sort of supervised by Maureen and by Richard, and I gravitated towards Maureen, and I guess a lot of the feminists gravitated towards Maureen. And so she had an awful lot of PhD students, and there were a lot of expectations on her, I think. And I also was sort of drawn to working with Richard because, in a way, he was more interested, perhaps, in psychoanalysis and theories of subjectivity. I mean, it's not that Maureen was actually fairly open about what direction he went in. That was one of the things I liked about the centre. I didn't feel like anybody was trying to mould me into a version of themselves at all, ever. So, you know, but I knew she would take more convincing, or maybe she just wasn't as interested, really. Whereas Richard was, was the kind of historian that felt, you know, you had to have some account of, I don't know what you'd call it, subjectivity, interiority, emotions, affects, various ways of thinking about that. But he was very, very interested in that in a slightly different way from Maureen. So for me, for my PhD to have those two, I felt very fortunate. And some people got that really good fit with, but nobody was working on film, so in that sense I didn't have that connection. Although there was a subgroup that was focused on film. So I guess it varied hugely, and some students found that fit and sort of found it in relation to their supervisors, and others found it in the subgroups and kind of established. So all the complexities around identity formation that we were kind of reading about in all the theory, about the tensions between subjectivity and identity, all of that theory that we were reading, and how that relates to power and so on, that was all getting played out all the time in these very porous, fluid sort of group dynamics that probably, yeah, we didn't really have a grasp of. And certainly rarely people actually talked about that. Rarely did people say, oh, well, you know those theories of X, well, this is what's going on in the room. That sometimes happened, I think. But, and I think the popular memory group, which weren't meeting anymore, I don't think, once I arrived, which I was a bit disappointed about because I would have found that very interesting, I think. But they had a reputation for having brought those things very close together, and that, you know, had sort of caused explosions in ways that were probably more intense than other groups had. So, yeah, I don't know if that gives you a sense.
Just to kind of follow up, I mean, I guess my next question really follows up from that a little bit. In the sense, I was going to ask about the political climate within the centre, in terms of, you know, feminism and race, that was obviously becoming increasingly important as well, and what the state of play was really in that respect. Because in particular I'm thinking about, you know, there's that moment for the previous women's group who decided at an end of year presentation that they were going to have women only members.
Right, okay.
And obviously, presumably the women's thesis writers group was women only as well.
It was, yeah.
Was that a political thing, or was that become slightly more softer by then?
I don't really remember it clearly enough to answer that honestly, but it was kind of, it wasn't announced ever, like this is a women-only group, but it was just assumed that that's what we would want to do because we were all feminists working on these issues and we needed a space in which we felt, you know, safe to have those discussions or something. But I don't think there was ever a guy who said, well, I'm working on feminism too in my PhD, could I? I don't think that just ever came up, really. But we certainly didn't have a sort of announcement about it, that it was women only. It just evolved somehow out of the feminists who wanted to share their work. And I guess, I mean, for me, my... I mean, a lot of people were involved in campaigns across these identity categories, and I guess for me, I was mostly involved in sort of campaigning against Thatcherism, is what I felt. And the Stop the Clause and then Stop Section 28 campaign that, you know, went on, I can't remember how long it went on for, but you know, many, many months, that just became the focus at that point, and then in the end that was what my chapter was about in the book, which had nothing whatever to do with my PhD. And that was the other thing, I guess. We were all doing stuff alongside our PhDs. You know, if my PhD student said to me now, is it right if I can write an article about, I don't know, something completely unrelated, you know, I'd probably say to them that might not be such a good idea in terms of your deadline and, you know, you need to... So that was... Nobody ever said to me, you can't be doing this because you need to be thinking about Hollywood stars in the 40s and the 50s. It was just part of the... That was part of the culture, that it was a good thing to be politically engaged in all these ways that crossed over. So I guess my focus at that time tended to be stuff around gender and sexuality, but it was always informed by debates about race and class and the problems with those categories as well, and the limits of those sort of identity categories as a sort of focus for theory and as a focus for politics, and, you know, attempts to sort of bring them together and cross over between them, and then, you know, then these clashes, and then the clashes with people who actually didn't really want to be dealing with those categories as a way of thinking at all. So...
And that was all played out in terms of the kind of debates that were going on just in the general daily life
in the MA, in the subgroups, even in the publications group, you know, there'd be people who liked stuff or didn't like stuff. And in the admissions group, you know, who you wanted to be your next cohort coming in to be in dialogue with, people, you know, obviously had different ideas about that. So I guess most people were politically involved in different ways, and that kind of then played itself out indirectly in their work and in their subgroups and so on. But that was my focus because of that campaign going on at the time. And yeah, there were a couple of us at the centre who were really involved in that campaign and, you know, took a leading role really in fundraising and setting up meetings at the town hall to have public debate and leafleting and so.
And I mean, was there any, whilst all this was going on, was there ever any notion of a career, an academic career? Was there, like, you know, was there kind of, you know, I guess now it's much more common for, you know, postgraduates to have this notion of a trajectory, do this and jump through the various hoops and stages and so on. Was that ever a culture within the centre whilst you were there that you were aware of?
Yes and no. It was funny because I guess most people do PhDs because they want to become academics, and certainly, as I said, the sense of the history of this place was a really important reason that people went there, and you felt its presence a lot, very powerfully. So, you know, when I arrived, I was very aware of the work of Janice Winship, who I think was teaching Wolverhampton at the time, or Lucy Bland, who had possibly got a job in North London Poly by then. So there were, you know, the previous generation of feminists whose work had been so influential and in a way, sort of collectively or collaboratively, through all the influence of their work, they had sort of founded a bit of a subfield, you know, that I was kind of very interested in. So I guess you had a sense that other people had gone on to have careers. You definitely did, and you definitely, you know, were keeping an eye on what they were up to in their publications. And Angela McRobbie, I'm not sure whether she was working at Goldsmiths by then, but there was a sense that these key figures and Charlotte Brunston was at Warwick, so you had this sense that there were these feminists from cultural studies who had gone on to have careers, and in some senses I hoped that's what I would do, but on the other hand I wasn't. Yeah, I didn't go into academia. I sort of came in through politics, so I never really went in thinking I want to have an academic career for the sake of having an academic career. And it was a different feel. It was, if there are these spaces opened up in the academy where you can do political stuff, like I went on to work at Lancaster and be very involved in women's studies at Lancaster. So for me that was perfect, because I could actually, I mean, it was a long, complicated history. It didn't stay perfect, but it gave me the perfect opportunity to try and do the kind of work I wanted to do. So there was an idea of a career in the sense that I hoped I would get some kind of a job. Although, you know, if I'd ended up having some kind of a job in adult education or through WEA or sort of, I don't know, something that straddled adult education and higher education, you know, I would have been interested in that too. So it wasn't categorically has to be. But on the other hand, there was no training, or there was no workshops on how to get a job or how to do your CV, or all the stuff that we now offer students, you know, career development. There was nothing, and a lot of people were there for ages. I mean, I actually took, you know, 7 years before I finally got my PhD for various complicated reasons. So there was no culture within the centre of saying to the PhD students, this is how you get a job. On the other hand, the generation before us had been, a number of them, not all of them, but a number of them had been very productive, actually very successful, and there is a sort of network, cultural studies network in the academy, and I don't know if I was aware of that, but if you look now across and see where all the postgrads from the centre have gone, you know, there has been an opening up of spaces, not in a sort of nepotistic way, I don't think, but in terms of opening up the kinds of degree programmes that are possible, the kind of approaches that we were doing, that then generated jobs that meant we fit the bill, as it were. So in that sense, maybe there was a culture of thinking about careers, but not in any way that would be familiar now.
I think Stuart Hall once wrote that they kind of described what the centre were doing in the 70s at least as trying to create organic intellectuals in the Gramscian sense. I mean, was that still kind of a background noise when you were there, in the mid to late 80s? I mean, and was that a tension with this, what you've just been talking about in terms of the spaces that have been created on the academic kind of, you know, network for cultural studies trajectories and careers? I mean, was that kind of did you see that as a tension, or was that by the time you were there that kind of faded slightly?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there was anything. I think that lingered. I wouldn't say when I was there I related to the idea of being an organic intellectual, but I would say by the time I was there I wanted to be a politicised academic, I guess, which is slightly different, and the focus was much more on institutional politics perhaps, and having to defend certain spaces or try and create certain spaces and keep that connection with politics, but, you know, under the burden of and the sort of onslaught of the sort of layers and layers of additional work that academics in general were being asked to do, but actually you could see the academics at the centre were having to do because of the institutional pressures. So I guess the sort of outward looking, politics is outside the academy and we want to bring it in, that became more and more difficult, partly because of the bureaucratisation of the academy and the endless amounts of time people have to spend on pointless tasks. But it also became, I think, a sort of focus of, okay, the politics now is in the academy, is about either defending the centre or about building up a women's studies programme or whatever. So the focus became much more about the academy as a political arena, and it became harder and harder, I think, for people to keep connecting. I mean, people do in quite inventive ways, but it became less obvious how to keep connecting to the politics outside the academy, as it were, and to keep that flow. I mean, there was a real flow, I think, when I look back on the time just before I got to the centre. I think that flow was probably at its most creative. But I think from sort of the mid-80s onwards, it was a little bit more like you had to defend the territory, and that was a politics in and of itself.
I mean, just finally, because I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but just wanted to kind of think about, just to end really, like what you think, how you kind of summarise the conditions that made all what I've just talked about possible at that period. And it sounds like from our discussion, some of those conditions might have been changing, which might be in the long run may have stopped to made it so it wasn't so possible to exist. So what were those? What do you think those conditions were, and what do you think made the centre ultimately so successful in that initial period? I think you'd have to do a cultural studies analysis of that, wouldn't you? Which would not be monocausal and would not be determined in any kind of obvious way, but would be something to do with the particular configuration of power and desire and ideas and politics that kind of were made possible. Obviously, it was partly to do with the individuals involved. It was partly to do with the who were inspiring and charismatic and utterly committed. But it was to do with the kind of space they were able to create that was hugely energising for a large group of people. And it was also partly the moment coming out of a moment where the left looked very, very different from how it looks now. A kind of, utopianism, idealism, vision, sense of possibility, sense of purpose, sense of meaningfulness around left politics and feminist politics and anti-racist politics kind of converging, and an interest in what the place of the cultural was within the political and vice versa, and that not really having been the focus of an intellectual project, for a long time. I'm not saying it never had been, but yeah. So the bringing together of those things, I guess, and the publications. I think, you could say what made the publications possible, but I think in terms of the sort of generations that then came to Birmingham Cultural Studies, the publications definitely sort of went out into the world and spoke to that desire for sort of an alternative intellectual political project, really. And it felt like a project. It was messy and, in some ways not coherent in good ways, but it did speak to, it generated and spoke to a sort of desire for a really deep-rooted understanding of the current political situation through an analysis of culture, through bringing that to bear on the disastrous sort of political situation that we were in, partly, which certainly when I was there gave a strong focus. So yes, so there would be multiple
things feeding into that, really, which would be about, you know, the ingenuity and energy and commitment of particular individuals, combined with the kind of way in which they came together to create, yeah, a sort of energising space of political vision, really, and tapped into that really strong political identification that was, you know, that was around in the 70s and 80s, and perhaps is much more dispersed now. So yeah, I think in order to answer that question, you'd have to try and sort of think of it within a sort of cultural studies framework, really, which has that multi-layered, sort of messy, sometimes incommensurate model of what culture might be, different elements of the cultural and political, sort of sometimes in tension, sometimes productively, so sometimes not. So yeah, I think something like that, I'd say.
Thanks so much, Jackie.
Okay, you're
welcome. That was really, really great.